Welcome to my video on the best books that I read in 2024, which I'm doing a lot earlier than I thought I would because I did not expect more than 200 of you to subscribe after my video last week. I said I would do this when I hit 1,000 subscribers, so I guess this is a much earlier than anticipated 1,000 subscriber special. There's going to be 15 books across a whole range of genres, and I've done this for every year since 2020. It was one of my first videos that I uploaded less than 6 months ago, so this is actually really much more than I ever thought would happen for an account that I just created to talk about books and really bump up my reading list and just sort of see what discussions we could get about modern literature and how great a lot of modern books are, as well as the classics, just because it's an art form that I appreciate so much. So thank you to everyone for subscribing and for watching. I'm really excited to do this video, and I think the next one will be on a halfway point of the year. I've almost read 70 books this year, so I'll do some highlights and lowlights. I might do one more video, but I will be taking a little break because, as I mentioned in my last video, I have a fiance who will become my wife in the end of next month. So yeah, let's get into these books. It's going to be a mix of just modern literary fiction, one or two classics, some poetry, some short stories, a memoir. I'll also be talking about some really good nonfiction, more historically researched books at the end. And I think it's different than fiction, but there is some really good research and information out there that I think you could supplement all the fiction readings you do. So a lot of books to talk about today. Hopefully I will do them justice. I encourage you to read each and every one of them. There isn't really a specific order to all of these books, except for the last fiction book I will talk about, which was my favorite one of the year. But all of these books are really, really incredible. I will actually start with some honorable mentions to even boost the list even more. So these are some books that I really, really enjoyed that did not quite make the list. The first was actually Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, which I did enjoy quite a bit. I really like her character work. Her ear for dialogue and just pacing is really good. The stream of consciousness in one of the brothers' perspectives really worked for me. I do find her style to be a bit stifling at times. You're really getting the full brain of the characters, but I did really enjoy this, and this is why in my last video I did say that I saw Sally Rooney's Normal People as really justified on the list of the top books of the 21st century. But Sally Rooney, really good. Didn't quite make the list, but I continue to be a defender of her fiction, and she maintains to be a really good person, including the recent essay that she wrote on Gaza, which segues into my second book, which almost made the cut, which is a really slim novella called Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. It's really two short stories in one. The first is the massacre of a Bedouin family by Israeli soldiers, told from the perspective of one of the commanders, and then halfway through it flips. There were a fictionalized version of the author. He's investigating that crime, and it's connected by the minor detail that the massacre happened 25 years to the day before the author's birth. It's a really focused book on the continuing violence of the Israeli state, from more explicit violence to just the indignities and the horrors of the border controls. Really, really good. Almost made the list, and I wanted to give it a shout out here. Also, Omeros, which is a really wonderful book of epic poetry that takes names and themes from Greek poetry and transports it to St. Lucia in this really wonderful hexameter that just examines the violence of colonialism and St. Lucia. It's a really good book by Walcott, but he's already won the Nobel Prize, and I wanted to give a shout out to two other books of poetry by less well-known authors that I think are really, really good, and I wanted to highlight them more. But really check this out if you want to get into a really long and excellent book of poetry. I also didn't include some rereads. So Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, one of my favorite novels of all time. I reread it, and of course it absolutely holds up as just a really great account of the early days of the civil rights struggle. If you haven't read it, it's one of the greatest American novels of all time, but I'm just not including it because it's something that I've read before, and these are all new reads. So without further ado, thank you again for watching, for subscribing, for liking, and let's get into the best books that I read. Starting with a short story collection, an Irish short story collection by Daniel McLaughlin, Dinosaurs on Other Planets, which is, I think, one of the best versions of short story collection I've read. All of them deal sort of with family strife and turmoil and relationships, but the prose is spectacular. The way that she can just sketch a full character so easily, and the depiction of the Irish coast, the grass, the sun, the wind, the waves, is just really incredible. I absolutely loved this collection, and it was the best short story collection that I read all year. If you haven't read her stuff, it's really good. Actually, the titular stories, the last one and probably the weakest one, but everything else just is so good, goes around similar themes, but each story is so wholly unique and so brilliantly evoked that I think you will just enjoy this collection, especially if you want just a quicker read. Each short story is just so contained. I don't know if you'll be able to stop at just one, but read this collection. My second short story recommendation is actually going back to a video I did on how to get back into reading fiction and overcoming a reading slump, which is Edwidge Danticat. There I recommended The Dewbreaker, but last year I read another collection, which is Crick Crack. And just like in The Dewbreaker, these short stories are all connected. Some characters sort of appear in different ones, and it's divided between Haiti and America. The Haitian stories at the beginning are all about people striving to improve their lives, but it's never in that sort of maudlin thing that you get around reading news stories and things about Haiti. There is a life and a really great depiction of the people that live there, and I think it's just a really good. And then as it moves forward into America, there's a lot more dealing with the diasporic community. There's a lot more humor as the toils of life lessen a little bit, but you still get these really great evocations of people. Danticat remains to me an under-celebrated writer, and I just think that as a Haitian American, her depiction of both her homeland and the diasporic community in Haiti is really good, and just the way that she structures these collections as this interconnected thing that makes you feel like you've read a whole novel is just really good. Of course, we have to delve into the classics a little bit, and somehow I had never read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and the other two novels in that collection, and I'm going to put Things Fall Apart here, which is just an incredible, really perfect novel. It follows an Igbo chief as his land is taken over by the white people, and the influence of that starts to pull apart the bonds that he's relied on. It's an unsentimental portrayal of Igbo society, so it is very patriarchal. There's some violence, but it also just shows the bonds of community and family and the imposition of the white man's religion, which things start to fall apart. I just think it's a really great, clear prose that evokes the land and the community so well. You can hear the chickens, you can hear the music, you can taste the food, and it is a sad but lovely story. And the whole trilogy really just shows the impact of colonialism through a great perspective. But this first one to me just really stood out as a great beginning to a wonderful story by one of the best storytellers, and I'm ashamed of myself that I didn't get around this to so long. But if you have not read it, this is your sign to read Things Fall Apart. It is one of the greatest novels of all time, and it's just depiction of everything. It's beautiful, the language, the story, the characters. It's wonderful. All right, let's take a break for some poetry, including one of the best poetry books I read, which was written by someone who lives right here in Toronto. Faith Arkful's Seventh Town of Ghosts is a poetry collection that has felt the most like a novel of any poetry collection that I've read. It traces almost a novelistic character arc. It's divided into three sort of amorphous sections, though there's more chapters as it visits the various towns, but it sort of starts with a family and this feeling of despair and connection, and then it moves into this realization of state and police violence, and then in the end section it moves into this discovery of love for life and family and relationships, and it's just this really beautiful journey. Arkful's writing is very clear and really easy to get into. The imagery that she evokes is really great, and I think even though it starts in darkness, it ends in light, and there's some really wonderful poetry in here, both short and long. She really plays. There's some found poetry, there's some erasure poems, there's just a really lovely collection. There's a lot of humor in this book too, so check it out, support a local author. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm really happy to highlight it. Another poetry collection which absolutely blew me away is Diana Nguyen's Ghost of. And the premise of it is just really horrifying. Nguyen's brother committed suicide, but before he did, he cut himself out of each of the family photos. And so you have these photos reconstructed through text of poems with the image cut out and that hollow space left there. Then on the opposite page, you have a short poem filling in the silhouette of her brother. The poems are heartbreaking about family relationships. Her family were refugees. There are some more traditional poems as well, but just the way that Nguyen sublimates her grief into this wonderful art, which just depicts family and her relationship with her brother, with her parents, their relationships with each other, and the grief that is exuded through this collection. One of the most exquisitely constructed things I have ever read, and just absolutely blew me away. It's a hard read, but absolutely essential reading. and one of the most unique books that I have read. But let's move back to novels, including a book which initially wasn't going to be in my top 10, but the more I thought about it, the more it grew on me. And it's Clarice Lispector, who actually I had never read before last year, and it's something that I need to remedy. I intend to read more of her this year. I still haven't gotten into it, but hey, we're only halfway through. This is An Apple in the Dark, and it follows a man who commits a crime and escapes across a vast plain, and he ends up in a farmhouse where he essentially reinvents himself from first principles. He becomes an innocent, he doesn't want to deal with what he's done, and it so almost becomes this biblical philosophical examination, which is fascinating, and it's doubled by Lispector's prose, which even in translation is this swampy, bubbly sort of thing that you have to wade through yourself. And it's just a really interesting book that the more I sat with it, the more interesting I found it. It might be better if it was half in length, or it might not be nearly as good. It was just a really interesting experience. Lispector's narrative voice is fascinating. The themes that she examines are really good. So apparently this isn't even one of her best loved books, but to me it was a really great introduction to her, and I really need to read more of her. And yeah, if you do need to start with Lispector, I think this is a really interesting one. And if you're thrown off at first, don't give up, because this was one that I wasn't sure I liked, but the more I thought about it, it made it my top 10. Another meandering book, which really I wasn't sure I liked at first, is Mircea Cărărescu's Solenoid. Cărărescu is a very celebrated Romanian author. This is my first book by him, and it is 600 pages of unedited novel. So apparently he just wrote this in one draft. It was not edited at all, and it shows, but it shows in an interesting way. It basically follows a school teacher who is Cărărescu if he had never become a successful novelist. So he's very frustrated with his life, but he also buys a house where there is apparently a solenoid which levitates on his bed. There's also a dentist chair which seemingly feeds on pain. He explores these vast underground caverns beneath Bucharest where there is a giant girl who is naked. There is a automaton with transparent insides. There's alien abductions. It is just a really bizarre novel, which again, I'm not sure if it's helped in translation, but the translation is interesting because you just get this overemphasized repetition of words like hyaline and peristalsis, which really gives the sense of Bucharest as this vast digesting city. It's a very surreal, nightmarish novel, and it's of course deals with the casual racism, particularly towards the Roma community, the way that they're treated by the school teachers of the rest of the community. It's just a very bizarre, dark, not particularly uplifting book, but it's unlike a lot of other books that I've read, and just the surreality and the imagery that he created, I think overcomes a lot of the gripes that I had with this book, and it's just stuck with me, all of the imagery. So I just had to recommend this book. If you're into dark narratives, literary fiction, pick this up and you will get through it, I promise you, and it is worthwhile. The ending is sudden and exhilarating in a way that you might be surprised at. So again, check this out. It's a very weird book. A lot of new words for you in translation, but I really, really enjoyed this book. But hey, say you want to read something beyond novels or short stories or poetry, I have you for graphic novels as well. Last time I recommended The Incredible Ducks by Kate Beaton, which is a great examination of the oil sands through memoir. This is much more traditional comics. This is Mike Carey's Lucifer, which is I think 72, 75 issues, and is just one of my favorite things. I've read it for the first time. I'd read parts of it before, but essentially he takes Neil Gaiman's Lucifer, the Fallen Angel, and he's created his own universe, but he's still stuck to our current one. And it's just a really wonderful exploration of theology, morality, philosophy. There's some really great characters. There's Lucifer's Lieutenant Mazikeen, who's missing half her face. Apparently they made a TV show of this. I don't think it was particularly good, and it can't cover half of the craziness that this book gets up to, but it's just a really wonderful exploration of so many themes within the Western canon in a fun way. And I will just mention that the art is incredible. There's beautiful paintings, and yeah, if you're just at all interested in this, check it out. And it does have a bit of that Gaiman taint, but Carey does his own complete thing with it. Actually, this year I picked up one of Carey's novels for the first time, which is Felix Castor, who is an exorcist. It's sort of a comedic, supernatural detective thing, completely different vibe than Lucifer. So even if you've enjoyed or not enjoyed those books, they're decent. This is just on a whole new level. I think Carrie's a really great comic artist, and just the art, the themes, the character development is all really, really good. Absolutely check out this. If you are into comics, or if you haven't been into comics, this is just an incredible run of a really great completed series. Before we get into my favorite novel of the year, I did sneak a memoir in here that's not part of my 5 top nonfiction. This is Hanif Abdurraqib's They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, which is a really fantastic essay collection. It follows him as a Black Ohioan. So the first part is him basically going to all these white punk and pop punk shows and just shows this really beautiful love for music. And then it shifts into these wonderful, more fully reported things. There's an essay on Prince's halftime show where you can feel the rain and just hear the guitar music. But I'm mostly recommending this because it contains one of the best essays I've ever read, which is The Night That Allen Iverson Crossed Michael Jordan. And it is just an ode to basketball, to blackness, to humanity, to never giving up, to just this beautiful imagery and time. And Abdurraqib is a brilliant writer. This thing just made me sit up, and I took a walk around my neighborhood just because it struck me so hard. The latter part of this book moves into essays on blackness and violence and protest, and it becomes less original. It's still very good, but it's something that you might have already read before. But this essays collection is worth it in general for the essays, but that Allen Iverson essay is just one of the best things I've ever read. I had to squeeze this on the list because it's just so good, and I need to read more of Abdurraqib. That essay just absolutely is wonderful. And that brings us to the best book that I read last year in fiction, which is Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus. This is a fantastic, surreal, magical, realist depiction of a Cockney woman who does a trapeze act and she has wings. Sophie Fevers, which is the Cockney pronunciation of feather. She's being interviewed by an American journalist, a young man, and it follows her as she goes through her act into Russia. And there's a fantastical scene in this miniature automaton hellscape in a palace. And there is a whole beautiful scene among the clowns who are led by this 7-foot tall clown called Buffo, which is this existentialist just play of just torment and life, and is just blew my mind. There's tigers sleeping on the tops of a cabin. All of it is just wrapped in this really wonderful prose that Carter evokes. Fevers is this incredible character, which is just delightful, and the themes of it are really fascinating. There's this whole escaped prison of women who are victims of sexual assault. There's the themes of the sort of old world passing to American dominance as the close of the 19th century bleeds into the 20th. And I just think overall the imagery, the characters, the writing, everything that she creates to create these themes as things shift also from the rail and electricity, just the evocation of a new age and the passage of the old into the new. Even it feels so modern, even it's about a century past. Just one of the best books I have ever read. Actually, one of the last books I read last year. And this book, if you haven't read Carter, she's most famous for her retelling of fairy tales in the Bloody Chamber, but this book is on a new level. It's really entertaining and it's really deep and is everything that you could ever want in a novel because it absolutely transports you to another time and another place. So that is my favorite book, but I urge you to not go just yet because I'm going to recommend some really great and really well-researched nonfiction books which absolutely changed how I perceived the world. But if you do want to leave, I would just encourage you to plug that I've moved my book blog onto a Substack recently. So it's about 3 years of blog posts, including all of these top books and the books from last year's. So it's hundreds of reviews, and you can follow me. I try to update every other week, at least. Usually it's more because I've almost hit 70 books this year. So read that. But if you still want to stick with me, here's some of the greatest nonfiction that I read last year. I don't read a lot, but I just read so many good ones that I figured, hey, we have to celebrate a little bit. So let's get into those ones. The first one I want to talk about is One Vast Winter Count by Professor Colin G. Calloway, which is a history of Indigenous North America before 1800s, so before essentially colonialism really devastated the populations as completely. And it's just a really great showing of how strong the indigenous peoples were and how long it took for colonialism to reap its effects, even with the ravages of disease. Because there's not a lot of archaeological history and written history of the time before contact, he relies a lot on oral histories, which is this really great depiction of civilizations from the vast mound cities to cities carved in the rocks in central North America. Just a really great depiction of the societies. And then when it gets into contact, you get all of the different flavors of colonialism, from the Spanish, who were just very religious, to the French, who seemed content to basically send horny fur traders down the river to intermarry as long as they sent back furs, to the haughtiness of the British, to the Americans, who were just all bent on conquest. And you get a flavor of the different indigenous peoples and tribes, from the Apache to the Comanche, who were incredibly fierce, to the Osage, who, if your only depiction of them is through the Scorsese movie Killers of the Flower Moon or David Grant's book. Grant's book does give you a bit of flavor, but just how the fierceness and the pride of the Osage people is really good, as well as the Iroquois Confederacy up north that drifted into Canada, which I'm much more familiar with. All of it is this wonderful depiction of a history that I knew not that much about. And it's full of all this really fascinating history, from how vegetable-based paint, which became really famous for pottery, only started being used because the Spanish took over all the lead mines. There's a story of a lacrosse game which was used as a Trojan horse, where they pretended to knock the ball into a local fort, and then they went to retrieve it, and then the warriors took the fort over. Or even how acorns were a staple crop in California. The history is really good, and if you're interested at all in the indigenous history of North America, this is a fantastic book to pick up, which is just really academic, but a really great read. A shorter but equally incredible book about modern history is Yasmin El-Rifay's Radius, which is a history of the Tahrir Square protests in 2013. El-Rifay was part of a feminist collective which sought to protect women from the gang assaults that were happening to them as they went to these protests. Gangs of men would encircle women and assault them. The first third is a really harrowing read because she has interviews and firsthand accounts of women being assaulted. And if you can get through that, it is just a reminder of the horrors that people face. It goes into a really fascinating overview of organizing and how they were seeking to protect people while also trying to get the political demands met. It becomes a history of alienation. El-Rifay goes to New York and she just watches as everything falls apart even more, and it becomes this almost memoir about what it is like to see your dreams crushed, but try to take lessons from those things, try to get hope. It's a really brilliant firsthand account, which is just beautiful. It took her like a decade to write this after the protests, and it just follows all of her community as she goes back, as the Muslim Brotherhood takes over and then Sisi takes in. It's just a lot to deal with. It is not despairing somehow, but it does deal with despair, but also finding hope and the belief in your community and just a feminist collective and how to actually protect yourselves. Incredible book. I still think of this. And actually, now that I think of it, I think this was the first thing I ever uploaded on this account as a short. So if you want to check that out, I think I have a short on this, a full review of this book, but it's great. In other books which are not particularly optimistic but are really essential is Anand Gopal's No Good Men Among the Living, which is his history of the US occupation in Afghanistan and all the mistakes that the US empire made. He interviews so many people, just how the US completely did not understand what it was doing and actually squandered a lot of the goodwill and opportunities, from just trusting warlords for really no reason and throwing in prison or killing a lot of the leaders in the communities that were working and on the side of the US. It just shows how a bully goes in and doesn't understand things. But the range of Gopal's reporting is amazing. He interviews a Green Beret who was protecting Hamid Karzai in this mountain pass before Karzai became president. And the Beret says, oh, I was in a firefight with this Afghan warlord, and I really wondered what he was thinking during that. And wouldn't you know, a few pages later, Gopal actually goes into that warlord story, how he became a warlord, the communist invasion, the civil war that drove him, and it's just an incredible portrait of society. It follows a woman who moved from the main city to her husband's village and basically wasn't allowed to leave because of the patriarchal norms. And as she becomes educated and gets her freedom, actually becomes a senator. But this book was written in 2013 during the first withdrawal, and so you can already see how things are starting to fail. And it hasn't gotten more optimistic since then, but it is just an incredible feat of reporting. It really just has these incredible people that Gopal gets access to and really shows how horrible the occupation was. It could have turned out much better, but the American Empire just is not good at these things and at anything really. So just a really incredible feat of reportage, one of the best books I read last year. And now second last, we actually have the story of an American family, Hidden Valley Road, which I think won an award or two, so it might be more familiar to people, but it's essentially a history of how society has treated schizophrenia. This was a mid-century American family that had 12 children, and 6 of the boys developed schizophrenia. And so it follows that whole family. They're a very waspy family. The dad was in the military, the mom was a homemaker, and how originally it was theorized that sort of frigid moms created schizophrenia, but it follows the scientific discoveries of how gene sequencing and things started to explain that there's a genetic component and how society and treatment of schizophrenics changed, while also showing this family's story and a lot of the things that the sisters and brothers all had to endure, as well as the parents. So just a really great way of blending the scientific and the personal in a really engaging story. It's a bit overstuffed. There's a bit too many meanderings into the scientific community, but overall, this book really struck me, and I think is a really essential. And finally, the best nonfiction book that I read last year was Vincent Bevan's If We Burn, which is a history of all the social media revolutions that you might have heard. So from Tahrir Square, but it follows the wave in Brazil as well as in Hong Kong, Indonesia, and just a really great history. Bevans was the LA Times correspondent in Brazil as well as in Indonesia, so he really just embeds with people and interviews them. And I think it's just a really great history of that, but is not just a history of that. It's in the latter half that this book becomes really incredible reading, where Bevans just starts to analyze how everything fell apart. He talks about how the right wing was able to co-opt a lot of these things and get leaders like Bolsonaro elected. He also talks about how strange some of it was because we don't really have touchstones of these sorts of revolutions in a lot of countries. Even like the 1960s, which are a touchstone in the Western Europe, they didn't really succeed, and those people ended up just becoming the bourgeois and very just sort of comfortable within the existing system. So you have things like we're in Hong Kong, where there's a lot of references to the Hunger Games and pop culture, which is not necessarily reality. And it is that divorce from reality which doomed a lot of these movements. They were very open and very leaderless, and they were very much focused on showing the power of the people, but they didn't actually focus on creating leaders and what to do with that power if they could get it. They were just shows of force. So they became something that was very easily co-opted by right-wingers, and when they figured out the rule book, you had people like Bolsonaro get elected. Bevans also recognizes that the internet is a tool, and like a lot of tools, people with money are very easily able to manipulate it. And so again, as soon as the advantage of this thing took off, it started to get co-opted by movements. Also, speaking of co-optation, Bevans talks about how it's really difficult to escape US hegemony. And so with the Egyptian revolution, you had the Muslim Brotherhood, but as soon as the US backed Sisi, it became a lot more difficult to go for it. So I think overall, this is just a really fascinating view of how these grand social movements, because they were leaderless and relatively directionless and focused not on institutions of power, but just showing broad support, were easily co-opted and fell apart. And we haven't seen the fruits of these protests, which a lot of people were really hopeful for. So I just think as a political analysis, it is an incredible book, a lot of firsthand accounts with people who were there, and I think the best book that I read in nonfiction last year. So there you have it. Those are the very best books that I read last year. There's 15 of them. Thank you again so much for getting me to 1,000 subscribers. Follow along. I'll have next week or the week after my halfway through the reading year list. I might have one about how I won my wife over with books, but then I will be on a short break. But I will see you again soon to talk about more books. Keep things going in the comments. I'll try to respond, not on my honeymoon, not during my wedding, but I'll try to respond when I can. And I will see you soon. Enjoy literature, enjoy books, however way they come, in poetry, in graphic novels, in short stories, in novels, in nonfiction, in memoir. All of it deserves to be celebrated. The written word is a fantastic means of communication, and I think whatever form it takes, it's worth talking about, it's worth experiencing. So thank you for coming along with me, and I will talk to you soon.